Batting in Test cricket has changed, partly because of mindset, physicality, the bats, but also technology. DRS has flipped spin and pace, because pre-war, you were slightly more likely to be at LBW to a spinner. Then after that, the spinners got almost no LBWs compared to seamers. And then that has recently flipped again, right at the point when we get technology and we start to understand about DRS. So at the moment, if you bowl spin in Test cricket, you are far more likely to get an LBW than any of the poor pace bowlers. And that is because the game has changed, and so has batting.
This was made using MV Players Insights. The same technology that supports the England and New Zealand Test players is available to club cricketers as well.
So this is all the dismissals by decade. So we're basically looking at percentages here. So we can see in 1870, almost 50% of the time, you're going to be out bowled or LBW. Almost all of those are bowled. And you can see here that there's been a lot of changes to our game over the years. Like for instance, in the old days, caught behind wasn't that common a dismissal. But stumpings were far more common, partly because a lot of seamers bowl with the wicketkeeper up at the stumps. But the problem with looking at all of this in one graph is it doesn't tell you that much about right hand or left hand or pace versus spin or anything like that. So one thing that's quite obviously changed in our game is that when we started, we just didn't have many left-handers, partly because people were discouraged from being left-handed in general society at that point. And as the years have gone on, we've seen more and more of these lefties come in, and then in the last few years, it's come up to about a third, which is a huge change. So it means up until the year 2000, this was essentially just a sport for right-handers, and now it's remarkably even. And one of the reasons there's so many more left-handers now than there used to be is because we've worked out that when you're holding the bat with two hands, being right-handed or left-handed doesn't really matter which side that you stand. So for instance, there are a lot of people who are right-handers who actually bat left-handed, like David Warner and Adam Gilchrist. And the opposite is also true. You get left-handers who sometimes bat right-handed. So the game has changed just from the way that we actually stand and bat. But let's look at right-handers first, because they are obviously far more important than left-handers because there's just more of them, right? But again, looking at all right-handers together doesn't really help us. Let's just break it down a little bit. This is right-handed batters versus right-arm seam, which would make up a huge percentage of overall deliveries bowled in Test cricket. Right-arm seam traditionally bowls more than 50% of the deliveries, and right-handers still face over 65% of all balls. But one thing worth looking at to begin with is these stumpings. We used to get a lot of stumpings. You'll hear a lot of people talk about how there were lots of fast bowls in the old days. But I think we can tell from the data that there are a lot of seam bowlers that were slow, because the stumpings basically finish in around 1940 and 1950 when it comes to seam bowlers. After then, it's very, very rare to get a stumping in a test match for a seam bowler. Does happen occasionally, of course, and I'm not just talking about the Johnny Bairstow one here. But there are two other really obvious patterns here, so let's have a look at those. The black line here is bowled. Bowled was the predominant way of being dismissed by our right arm seamer if you're a righty yourself. Whereas the red one is LBW, and for the longest time, LBWs weren't a big deal. And then over the last few decades, they've become kind of equal, right? You're almost as likely to be bowled as you are LBW. That's slightly changed in the 2020s, although we're only a few years in. But what this graphic really shows you is the most dominant form of bowling against the most dominant form of batting has completely changed. And some of this is to do with some slight changes to the LBW law, but also to right arm seam bowling. If you think about this period in here, the majority of the right arm bowlers were trying to bowl outswing. It's not particularly easy to get an LBW if you're trying to bowl outswing. Whereas once we get to the 1980s and the West Indies take over, we have a lot more seam bowling, which means the ball's nipping around a lot more and often coming back in. And these days, it's almost impossible to find a bowler whose main skill is outswing. But this is the right arm batters versus left arm seam. And there really wasn't a lot of left arm seam bowled, and you can see just how random some of these numbers are. There's one year here where the right-handers are more likely to be bowled than any other dismissal against left arm seam, but there just wasn't a lot. The first left arm seam bowler to take 100 wickets in Test cricket doesn't begin his career until the 1950s. But I think the 1990s is the most interesting, because I just wonder how much of this is Wasim Akram almost entirely on his own. The bowled goes up 5%, and the LBW is still well over 20%. So that means in 1990, you were a 39% chance to be bowled or LBW from a left arm seam bowler. That's pretty huge numbers. All right, so let's move on to the left-handers here. Now, in the 1870s, there was practically no left-handers around, but I do love the fact that when they did bat, they all got bowled 62% of the time, which is absolutely beautiful. But again, this is against pace and spin, and it doesn't tell us all that much. Although if I was to look at anything, what was going on in the 1940s with left-handers, and why were they going out hit wickets so often? And this is left-handers just against right-arm seam. And again, why are they going out hit wickets so often? I mean, there must be a reason in a story, and one day I'm going to have to go back and try and work out exactly what happened. But that is a very weird quirk. But clearly there's much more important things here that we should be looking at. But while we're having some fun, this is left-handed batters versus left-arm seam. Especially in the early part of cricket when there just aren't many left-handers, you're going to get some pretty wild things. Like, for instance, 100% of the dismissals in the 1870s of left-handed batters to left-arm bowlers were bowled. I love that. That's just absolutely genius. And it's like 80% in the next decade as well. But you can see here just how random some of this data is. And that's because there aren't a lot of left-hand batters and there's way less of southpaw bowlers. And so what you get is a very erratic pattern. But from the 1950s onwards, we start to get a lot more left-arm bowlers in. And this is when I think it gets interesting, because this is the LBW rate here. And we can see in the 1950s, it hovers around 12%, 7%, and even comes down to 6%. And then it goes up to 15, 20, 19, and this year it's back again at 14%. And what slightly surprises me about this is that left-arm seam bowlers generally swing the ball away from left-handers, yet they've still got quite high LBW ratios. I'm not sure I quite understand that. And I also don't understand why it suddenly dropped off a cliff recently as well. But because there aren't as many left-handers and there isn't as much left-arm seam, this could be all random. But this does look more like a normal pattern, but it might mean absolutely nothing. But I can't work out what it means, so it could just be an anomaly. So this is left-hand batters versus right-arm seam, and you can see a very similar pattern to what we saw before. They used to get bowled a lot, and now they get LBW a lot. But what is interesting here is that bowled has actually taken a bit of a lead again. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that they're bowling around the wicket a lot more. Whereas in this period, you're bowling over the wicket to left-handers. And now right-arm bowlers are bowling around the wickets. And so it's come up with its own distinctive pattern. And in this one, we're just looking at pace bowlers and how they dismiss batters. Now, this is all the pace dismissals in the history of Test cricket, right? And there are a couple of very obvious patterns here. One is bowled and the other one is caught behind. But I wanted to take a slightly closer look at that. You can see that when Test cricket starts, bowled is obviously the dominant form of dismissal. We talked about that before, and there's many reasons for that. One is that the pitches would deteriorate a lot more. One is that the ball didn't bounce as much because they were quite often softer. There's also the fact that we used to put manure on the wickets, which meant that the surfaces weren't as smooth. But the other pattern here, of course, is caught behind. Caught behind just wasn't really a major form of dismissal for seam bowlers for a long period of time, and we can see now that since the 1970s, it has completely taken over. So a quarter of all pace wickets now are caught by the wicketkeeper. And if you include the slips and everything else in here, this would go off. Unfortunately, we don't have records of slips catches versus non-slips catches through the history of cricket. But my guess is that catches behind the wicket in those positions have just gone absolutely through the roof as well. So previously, bowlers would bowl to try and hit the stumps. And if they didn't hit the stumps, maybe hit the pad. Now bowlers bowl for the outside edge. And it's a much different game because of that. And it isn't just pace bowling that we've seen that's changed, because spin has as well. You can see the black line here is pace and the red line here is spin. Both of them over the decades have just been far less likely to bowl people out. And this is a very important thing to have a look at and to remember, especially when your auntie complains that all techniques are terrible now and batters used to be really good. That's just not the case. Techniques actually used to be a lot worse. There were other conditions why batters got bowled as well. But essentially, batters are much better now at just not being bowled. It's not a thing that we see a lot more attacking shots, and so we see a lot more bowls. Modern players, even those who don't trust their defenses, still don't actually get bowled that much. So much so that you could say that this is now a fairly odd dismissal in Test cricket. You're much more likely to see someone just caught in the ring or caught behind the wicket by the wicketkeeper or the slips. So bowls really stand out in a way that they didn't through the history of cricket. But let's just have a look at spin here. This is all the spin dismissals distributed by decade. And LBWs are definitely on the move, but we showed you that at the start. There's something else I want to focus in on this side of the graph, but let's just make it a little bit more clear for you. This is the stumpings in the history of Test cricket. And you can see that stumping rates were always quite high against spin all the way through until the 1960s. And suddenly there is a change, and you can see from that point forward we haven't really seen that much difference. There's a little bit you could see in the 2010s and in the 2020s. Stumping rates are down, but they're not massively down. Whereas stumping rates in the 1950s were 6.4%, and by the 1960s it was under 4%. A lot of this has to do with the pace of the older spinners. They bowled incredibly slow. Clary Grimmett and these kinds of bowlers really tossed the ball up, and so it made a lot of sense to use your feet. From the 1960s onwards, we've seen spinners bowl a little bit quicker. But what's interesting is that the rate hasn't changed all that much. It stayed fairly flat all the way through here before this slight drop off. I would have expected more of a drop off in the 2010s and the 2020s, just because batters don't use their feet as much as they used to, because spinners are so much quicker than they previously were. But perhaps because we're seeing more attacking shots, when people do come down the wicket, they're a big chance of being stumped. Whereas perhaps in this period when you were coming down the wicket, you were also doing it to defend. Almost no one now comes down the wicket to defend anymore. If they come down, it's to maximize. But this one maybe interested me the most. I wanted to look at the runouts by decade here. And you can see that runouts were pretty common for a long time until the 1920s. In the 1930s and the 1940s, we have this incredible dip. And then in the 1950s and 60s, it goes back up again, but it's been on the decline ever since. And what's really interesting is that in the 1990s is when Australia starts to bring ODI running to Test cricket. And realistically, it doesn't mean that we see a lot more runouts. And I think part of the reason we see even fewer runouts here than we do in any other period in the history of game is there are just more boundaries hit now. There are less actual runs run than ever before. Back in this era, you really did have to leg quite a lot of your runs. There were bad outfields, the bats weren't particularly good. The bats really don't become decent until the 1900s. None of this really explains this dip in here when runouts just stopped. But my guess is the other thing that changed is through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, is the batters actually got better at running because they're a lot more professional now than they used to be in the old days. A lot more limited overs cricket also helps you with your running because it's a far more important part of that game. So this improvement is probably down to the amount of boundaries that is hit and also the professionalism and the quality of running between the wickets that we see today. And so finally, the last thing that we wanted to have a look at here is to sort of normalize runs per over and average, because this gives you a good idea of what kind of era each one is. For instance, from the 1870s through to the 1910s, it was very much still a bowling era. And in that period of time, teams actually scored at a fairly decent rate. It's just that they couldn't stay in very long. As pitches get better, you see this huge boom when no one actually knows how to get anyone out. And this ends up with things like bodyline and changes to the LBW laws as well. But you can also see that the scoring rates change. This one here is one of the most interesting ones because in the 1950s, we actually see batters not make a lot of runs and do so really slowly. I would call that cricket's dead ball era. And then after that, we see this slow progression of scoring rates, but batting remains pretty solid all the way through. And I think this progression of scoring rates kind of tells you that it isn't just T20 cricket and one-day cricket that have changed. Batters have actually been scoring quicker for a long period of time now. It was certainly on an upward curve well before one-dayers take over in the 1990s. But what's most interesting at the moment is probably over here, because this is the first time in 110 years that batters have actually been scoring quicker while averaging less. You can see in the 2010s, it's actually almost exactly the same. And that's because the second part of the 2010s is the wobble ball era, and the first part is not. So now this is completely the wobble ball era, and teams have decided they are not going to just sit around and wait for a bowler to seam a ball back into the top of their leg stump. They're going to attack and they're going to take risks. On top of this, it's the same thing against the spinners. You can't use your pad anymore to defend, so batters are willing to score quicker. So how has Test cricket changed? Well, I think this shows us so much. That this was a game that was completely dominated by bowlers for a long time, and then batters took over for decades, and now the bowlers have started to fight back. So the batters who were very happy to be conservative and just make sure that they never went out and just looked after themselves have now decided, well, if we're going to go out anyway, we might as well have some fun with it. I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories, like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the Empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.